Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short 30-minute session on influence. Tim Baker's my name, and I'm going to give you a couple of very short tips that might assist you to just improve your ability to persuade people. I mean, when we think about it, we're all in the business of influence. Now, we're trying to influence our colleagues, we're trying to influence our boss, we're trying to influence our team members. It never ends. And of course, if you're not influencing somebody else, they're often trying to influence you. So let's talk a little bit about the topic today and give you a sense of how you might improve your influence. Okay, so just a bit of background about myself, because some of you may not know who I am. Tim Baker, as I mentioned. You can see that I obviously write books. The end of this year, I'll have written 18 books. And of course, one of those books is the New Influencing Toolkit, which this material comes from, and it's been very, very popular in different countries around the world. You can also see that I am a keynote speaker. I also present workshops in a variety of different leadership type forums and topics. And you can see up the top there in the right-hand corner, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. And at my age, of course, you have to recover. It takes about 2 weeks to recover. So we play every second week. So there you are. All right, let's get into the topic and have a look at what we're covering. I think one of the objections about influence is that when I mention the word influence, people often think about being cunning and underhanded. And of course, people are cunning, or some people are at least cunning and underhanded. And of course, they can influence people by being cunning and underhanded. But I'm not really referring to that today. I'm really referring to influence very much around from an ethical perspective. In other words, the other person actually knows that you're influencing them. So it's not something that's manipulative. So please take that out of your mind, because today is really about how you actually get other people to do what you want, or perhaps think a different way, but to do it in an ethical and transparent way. So I just want to make that absolutely clear up front. Okay. So what I'm intending to cover in our very short time together is, I first of all want to talk to you about what influence is, because I think when people mention the word influence, lots of things come into people's minds about it. And if you go and Google the word influence, you will get literally millions of definitions. And what I'll do is, of course, share with you what my definition of influence is all about. I'm going to share, because the title suggests it, but I'm going to share the 4 influencing styles. And while I'm doing that, you might like to think, well, which of those am I most likely to exhibit most of the time? And at the end of this, I've got a special offer for you to take, because you're taking the time to be here today in this presentation. All right, so let's just unpack the word influence for a moment. So, of course, a lot of my work is with leaders, and leaders are in the business of influence. I mean, it is critical to your success to be able to persuade other people. But basically, my definition is this: the power to make other people agree with your opinions, or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. Now, there's a couple of key points there. It could be about changing people's behavior, or it could be actually about changing people's opinion. So, or it could be both, of course. So it's about either of those two things. Now, ironically, I'd have to say to you that changing people's opinions is actually more difficult than changing people's behavior. For example, you can get somebody to do something, change their behavior, but of course, if their mindset hasn't changed, they're likely to recoil back to the way they were. So, for example, if you suggested to people that they should be more courteous to your customers or your clients, for example, you might find that the first couple of iterations with customers, the person tones it down and they're quite pleasant. But of course, if they don't think that that's their role, then ultimately they're probably not going to have sustainable behavior that you're expecting. So that's the first part of the definition. The other part of the definition that's important there is the last part there, where it says you want to do it, they want to do it willingly and ethically. Now, what that means, of course, is that it's not manipulative, it's not underhanded. Basically, what I'm attempting to do is I'm trying to influence people ethically, so they know they're being influenced and they're willing to be influenced. In other words, they're making the decision ultimately to change their behavior or their opinion based on our influence. So I just wanted to be absolutely clear about that before we went any further, so that you understood the distinctions there. Now, one of the other points I'd want to make before I launch into looking at the 4 influencing styles is this, that you, if you are a leader, and even if you're not a leader, I'd still argue this, leaders are in the business of influence. So basically, if you're a leader, a manager, a team leader, whatever it might be, you are what I might refer to as a professional influencer. Your job is actually to try to persuade and influence or convince people either to change their behavior, to continue their behavior, or to change their opinion, or to reinforce the opinion. So I think this is very, very important, because I often come across people who say to me, oh, look, I'm not really, I just come to work and I do my job and I just call it as it is. I don't think that's good enough. I think you've got to actually make the effort to become better at influencing. And I'm sure that's why you're here today, this morning. All right, so let's now, one other slide before we launch into the 4 influencing styles. Now, there are 3 key characteristics in every situation of influence, and this is important. You have a preferred style and approach. Now, you may not know what that is, and I have, I've got a profile that you can do. You just have to send me an email, and I'm happy to send out the profile to you. It's very reasonably costed, and you will get a very good handle on your influencing style and approach. But nevertheless, your style, your approach is obviously going to influence, is going to be prominent. So for example, if you're a person who enjoys facts and figures when you're arguing your case, well, guess what? You're going to use facts and figures to demonstrate your case. Now, that's fine. It makes perfect sense to you and your influence, because, that's the way you like to operate. But what about if you're working with someone who's not really influenced by facts and figures? And of course, we've all been there, haven't we? That's where the glaze goes in the eyes, and people actually, they're not influenced at all. And of course, what you do is you try harder and harder by throwing more and more facts and figures at this person to try to get them to change. But what you should be doing is changing yourself. What that means is you need to use a more flexible approach. You need to try plan B, basically. Now, the other person, as I'm alluding to, has an influencing style and approach as well. Now, of course, we don't know what that is unless you know them very well. And you may be able to identify these people when I share with you the model, but they have their own way of wanting to be influenced. So, for example, if there's a person who's very belief-based, they're very much influenced by behavior that's congruent with their values, then of course that's their style. And if you communicate to them that way, then clearly it's going to resonate with them, because it is congruent with their style, which is about beliefs and values. So you can imagine a situation where someone who's very facts and figures oriented is working with someone who is very belief-based. It's probably not likely to be a useful approach to use. What it basically means is if you're the person trying to influence the other person, you're the one that has to change their perspective or the way you do, the way you go about what you do. Now, the third characteristic in any influencing situation is the context. Some circumstances require quick action, other circumstances require collaboration, and that's often about the context. Obviously, in an emergency, it's a completely different scenario than it would be if you're introducing a new system into your team. So context is critically important. And that will, so really, we've got three variables, haven't we? We've got your style, we've got the other person's style, and we've got the situation that we're in. And usually when we're influencing people, we're not really thinking about those things. What we just want to do is to get the other person to do what we want them to do, or perhaps to think the way we want them to think. So we will just automatically launch into our own style, and we'll find that perhaps we come up short because we haven't taken into consideration two critical factors: the other person's style and approach, and of course the context or the situation that we're in. So hopefully that gives you some sense of things that need to be considered before you go into launch into influence. Now, what you're seeing in front of you right now is my influencing capability framework. Now, I put this together because when I looked out there in the marketplace, I found that at one end of the continuum, there was lots of sales type influence, how to get people to buy the product or the service. And whilst that's very relevant for sales, it's not so relevant for management. And on the other end of the continuum, there was quite a lot of sort of academic material that wasn't really relevant to helping people in a practical sense improve their ability to convince other people. So I thought there must be something right in the middle. And that's where I came up with my influencing capability framework that's in front of you right now. So what I'm going to do is share it with you. And as I said before, if you're interested in doing the profile, then send me an email and I can direct you to the right place to do that. But you'll notice up the top, it's a typical 2x2 matrix, of course. A lot of these models are, as you know, but you've got push and pull. Now let's have a look at what push and pull actually means. And I've got a little graphic here that might help you. So if you look at this, you can see that really push and pull. So people who like to push when they're influencing will have a tendency to be fairly one way. They will propose, they'll give information, they'll tend to block out or shut out other perspectives, and they'll take the idea to the person. So if a profile that you completed showed that you had a higher percentage in your push style compared to your pull style, that probably wouldn't surprise you, nor would it surprise the other people that you're influencing, because that's the way you go about your business. But on the other hand, you'll notice the pull style, which is almost the opposite. That's where you enable, you test understanding, you ask questions, you seek out people's beliefs and you bounce off those. And it's very much a more collaborative style of influence. And of course, it's very, very relevant in certain situations, and in other situations, it's not a good idea. So, of course, the context can depend on whether you should use a push or a pull style, but you have a natural tendency towards one or the other. Although I've seen some people having profiles that are very, very even across the top, and that's fine, because that really does suggest that the person's able to maneuver from one style to the next, depending on the situation they're in or the person that they're working with. So that's the first one. Now you can see there that the next category there is on the left-hand side, which is logical and emotional. Now, they're reasonably self-explanatory, but here's a little explanation to go a little further. So people who have a tendency to use a logical approach when they're influencing people will tend to use facts and evidence. They'll be quite rational, usually fairly structured, and have a measured approach. So people who like to do that will certainly exhibit those traits. Now that's fine, of course, if you're working with someone who thinks the same way, because obviously that'll resonate with them. But what about someone who's has an emotional approach to influence? Now, the emotional approach is more around values and beliefs and feelings and those sorts of things. And of course, ironically, and I've done a lot of these profiles across lots and lots of organizations, and I can tell you for sure that there are many, many people who have an emotional approach to influence, many more than we probably imagine. I mean, I think a lot of us like to think we're very logical, but I think a lot of us are actually driven by values and beliefs more than we probably are willing to admit to ourselves. So basically now, and of course your profile shows a difference between the two, but basically now you can see that we've got 4 different strategies, 4 different ways of influencing people. So I'll run through those with you and perhaps give you some examples of leaders that exhibit those traits. So if we look at the first one there, which is investigation, investigators use a push style predominantly and are usually logical in their approach. And what they tend to use is they marshal their facts and figures, they do a little bit of research, they collect their evidence, and then, of course, they will launch into convincing other people, usually in a one-way approach, and they will convince them because they've done their homework, and they will use logic to try to convince or persuade the other person or persons of their view of the world. And so if you think about occupations that might fit the bill here, you've got, for example, police is a very good example of that. Police will tend to go out, they'll do an investigation, they will collect their evidence, they'll put their evidence into a sequence of events and put that before a court of law, and that's usually what happens. Another example of an occupation that uses this is a scientist or perhaps a researcher who will have a hypothesis, and what they will do is they will try and prove or disprove that hypothesis with a particular methodology. And of course, many of these papers that scientists and researchers produce, if they're timely, can have enormous influence in the way we look at things. So there's 2 examples. Now, a good example of a leader who might exhibit that is somebody like the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore. When Al Gore left the White House in 2000, in that controversial election against George W. Bush, he went and reinvented himself as a climate change activist. And if you've ever seen that video, The Inconvenient Truth, there's no shortage of charts and graphs and statistics and facts that he's trying to make his case, of course, that we should do something about climate change based on a whole lot of evidence. Now, the other push style there is motivation. The only difference there is that the motivator will tend to use emotion rather than logic. So, motivators will tend to enjoy talking about the big picture. They're usually quite good at giving presentations, usually very good storytellers. So they very much are talking about the sort of the end result of the big picture. And if you think about occupations that fit that model, you've got people like entrepreneurs, and you've got people who have who are advertising agents who only have a very small amount of time to convince us. So what they do is, of course, they tug at our heartstrings because that's the way. They don't have time to give us all the facts anyway. And probably a leader that fits the mold very well there would be the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And he gave one of the greatest speeches of all time, I Have a Dream, in 1964. He was assassinated tragically in 1968. But in that speech, there is absolutely no facts whatsoever, but there is beautiful rhetoric, beautiful timing, and his I Have a Dream speech, of course, is well known all over the world. And of course, he was trying to convince at the time, Americans to take civil rights far more seriously than perhaps they were before. Now, we move across to calculation. Now, I couldn't get a better word for calculation. It sounds a little bit devious. It's not really. But calculators use a pull style and use a logical approach. So what a calculator will tend to do is to talk up the advantages of their proposal, and they'll also talk down opposition to that proposal. So in other words, people kind of know where they stand with a calculator. And if I think about occupations of people who would very much be in that calculation area, we're probably talking about salespeople, for example. So, for example, if you go and buy something, a product or a service, normally the person selling you the product or service gives you all the benefits. You know, here's all the things that you need to consider. But on the other hand, they'll talk down, you know, they'll basically give you a deadline. They'll say, well, look, this deal only goes until, you know, close of business today. You really need to get on board. And I remember walking past a computer shop probably a couple of weeks ago, walked past, and on the door there was this sign saying 50% off laptops. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. I wasn't in the business of buying a laptop, but it got me in the door. As soon as I got in the door, there was another sign right there that said, must purchase by the close of business today in order to get your product. So in other words, it leveraged me into a corner that if I was going to buy a laptop and I wanted to get the 40% advantage, the discount, I had to purchase by today. So that gives you a bit of a sense of that. Now, usually in the workplace, calculators like process and procedures. They like key performance indicators, and they're sticklers for doing things by the letter. The final one there is the collaborator. Now, the collaborator also uses the push style, so they like to work with and through other people, but you'll notice that instead of being logical, they'll be emotional. And the big difference there is that collaborators are usually very, very good at building team harmony. So they're very good at building the team, and they do that extremely well. And so what happens, collaborative leaders often bring teams together, and people feel a sense of loyalty to each other because of the way the leader is using their influence. A good example of someone perhaps that might fit that bill might be somebody for example, Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa was anointed by a saint from the Catholic Church many years ago, but all the work that she did in the streets of Calcutta and Bombay and all of these places in the world, she did a lot of that with voluntary labor, and she had really her ability to collaborate with NGOs and government agencies really was a critically important plank in her success for the extreme poverty-stricken, the homeless. And she, of course, did many good things in that realm. So which one of those are you? Does it help? And I guess if it doesn't help, we might actually think to yourself, well, hang on, I'm all four of those things. Well, if you are all four of those things, I would say to you, that's great, because actually all four of those things is a good thing, but it's probably likely that you will favor one of those four, whether it's investigation, calculation, motivation, or collaboration. Now, in order to be effective as an influencer, because you come across people from all walks of life, and you have all sorts of contexts and situations to deal with, what you should be trying to do is to exercise all four of those at the right place, at the right time, with the right person. Now, that doesn't mean you're not being authentic. It just simply means that you are being flexible in your approach. Because remember, if we divided the whole world up, we would probably have approximately 25% of the population would be investigation, 25% of the population would be calculation, and 25% of the population would be motivation and collaboration. All right. So, two things before I want to finish up, if I may. And if this is your first time here on a Friday, you should be aware that every Friday at this time, every Friday, I have a similar session, 30 minutes, and I'm doing that because I realize we're all busy and it forces me to get to the point as well. But next week, I have a session on redesigning jobs through job crafting. How might you go about that? And that comes from my latest book coming out in May, which is The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. So I'm going to exhibit, what are the steps you need to do to get job crafting happening. And you'll see that that's next Friday on the 8th. And there's the link. Now, you'll receive a copy of these slides and recording at the end of today's session, which is great. All you have to do is click on that link, just as you did for today, and you'll be in and ready to go. So as I, love to see you next week, if that's something you might be interested in. And the final thing I'd like to do, as I said, I'd give you a special offer this time round. There's my book. Basically, the survey that I have shared, that I've talked about, is actually in the book. So the great news is, if you purchase the book, you're getting the survey, and you're also getting 68 different strategies around how you can improve your influencing capability around those 4 influencing styles. So if you go on to Amazon, it's priced at $77 at the moment, but I'm going to give you a special offer today of $29 plus postage. So all you've got to do is send me an email, and there's my email. You send me an email by the close of business today, and I will arrange that for you. I've got a batch of books here in the office. I will sign it for you personally. I will send it out to you. And of course, I'll send you an invoice as well. So folks, that's it from me. Let me just stop sharing my slides for the moment, just to personalize things a little bit. So that's it. So hopefully we'll see you next Friday. I hope so. And of course, if you'd like a copy of the book, you know what to do. Just send me an email. Thank you, folks. I've enjoyed our time together. I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you, Craig, as always, very supportive of my sessions, and really appreciate that. We'll catch you next Friday. All the very best. And I should say also, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And we'll catch up perhaps next Friday. Thanks, everyone. All the best and goodbye.